To the Attorney General of Australia, the man that poured gasoline and ignited himself running at the Brisbane Family Courts on the 7th of June 2010, after losing his case in the Federal Magistrates Family Court, I know a judge that could traumatize a person to such an extent. I heard he died shortly after he was extinguished on the steps of the Brisbane courts. I claimed refugee status in the UK and Norway due to my nightmare experience of the Australian family courts. I have informed immigration that if any Australian citizen needs to flee Australia from the family courts, such as the Judge Demack, my home is open and free of charge. This is not going to affect my family law matter in the UK. There is no reason for myself to win favour in a secondary court case in Australia. I am doing this purely because I wish to protect Australian citizens and residents against Anne Demack. No one should endure the torture in the proceedings with Anne Demack. I have permanent damage to my body. I have suffered assault as described by my psychologist and doctor from the acts and trauma of Demack's courtroom. I have 3 witnesses. If this was a normal procedure with the behavior, I do not believe that my transcripts would have remained as per the lawful records, as they would have had to be altered to protect the interests of Anne Demack. I understand and support Mr. John Astor's claims of his experience of Judge Anne Demack in the Federal Magistrates Court of Brisbane and Lismore. This is a secondary complaint of the same nature. I have had the great misfortune to have encountered Judge Anne Demack and her unacceptable manner in which she addresses mothers and fathers in her courtroom, with her established bias from the start off. I was treated as a person with little worth, as though I was a second-class citizen living under apartheid. Just I had white skin and was a woman, a mother. Judge Anne Demack was so biased, and her treatment of me and my ex-husband was very profoundly noticeably different. My experience of Judge Anne Demack and her practices in a courtroom on my day of cross-examination was like I was on the stand and I was treated like a criminal. I was fired questions at by the opposition barrister and child barrister at the same time without my team protecting me, and whilst being screamed at and was told to answer immediately. This made my cross-examination very hard to be able to reflect on questions and answers with complete clarity. However, I did not lie, as the father of the child did under oath in his cross-examination. He was offered breaks by Judge Magistrate Anne Demack and even offered a glass of water. I was offered no breaks, no water, and was drilled over an extra hour compared to the father. The outline of the case which I received by my barrister was not how the case proceeded through the 4 days of court that we all endured. All my witnesses were thrown out of court and were not heard. These are people that had to hang around the court all day and had to take off work, people abroad who had to be on standby late at night because of time zones, and people who had travelled from one side of Australia to the other. My witnesses were thrown out of court because I was bullied and threatened by my own lawyer and barrister that if I did not sign that piece of paper, then I would never see my daughter again. I did not agree to sign this paper, but with this real threat, what choice did I have, since I thought that my team were acting in my best interest? The paper stated that there was not enough evidence that my daughter had been interfered with sexually. This was firstly not true, and secondly I did not agree, but was bullied to sign this paper in the fear that I would not see my daughter again. When I arrived in court the next day, Judge Demack lost the plot with my change of course, which was not my change of course, but my lawyer and barrister's change of course. I was not permitted to say this to Judge Demack. After this episode, I have had extreme nightmares about this whole happening, including my inhumane treatment of my cross-examination and having Judge Demack give me filthy looks and not stop the opposition tearing me to shreds verbally and her yelling when the course was changed. Demack ruled sole custody to the father when my daughter had lived with me her whole life. The first report writer wanted to keep the contact as it had been between me and my daughter. However, the second family report writer was completely unprofessional and unscientific, whom was examined in court. Demack was furious that I had this report writer cross-examined, and she was very annoyed at my barrister putting the report writer through this cross-examination. Judge Demack overruled this fact and accepted her report for a sound family report. I was interviewed for 20 minutes, and the other party had 3 hours by the family report writer Barbara Davies, plus written material sent to the family report writer by the father, and I was completely denied to give any written material except for my AVO, which is my domestic violence order, and the domestic violence resource center material, which was hardly mentioned by the report writer. I was having constant nightmares about this Judge Demack shouting at the top of her voice at me for something I did not do myself. Judge Demack refused point blank for me to say goodbye to my daughter at court. My lawyer stood up and begged Judge Demack, but she would not budge with this decision until my ex stood up and said he wanted me to say goodbye to our daughter. I was told I had 2 minutes by Judge Demack to say goodbye, and I was not to shed a tear in doing so. There were many witnesses to this horrendous happening on the 12th of August, 2010. My daughter had her step-grandmother there from South Africa, and she was not allowed to say goodbye either, whom has not seen or spoken to my daughter since. I spoke to my lawyer about an appeal, but he seemed to think that I would not be granted an appeal by Demack. I was obstructed visits at the contact center, and when I did see my daughter, she looked very depressed and had swollen face and extreme eczema. This is never regarded by the unprofessional people who work at these centers. Your contact centers need to be shut down and replaced with people whom are qualified to see these signs when children are depressed and have been abused. My daughter did not want to leave me after the visit was finished and cried, and it was written later in her father's affidavit of how our daughter would cry in the car all the way home asking to come back to her mother. When I did get weekend visits after 6 months, my ex-husband illegally removed my daughter from one side of Australia to the other, from New South Wales to Perth. At this time, I had rights to be asked about removing Hedda out of school. He did this when I was away. I found this out from my daughter, whom told me, and I called my daughter's school and the police, but nothing was done about it, as he lied and said he was doing a job there for just 3 months and would return to the area of Mullumbimby thereafter. My daughter was never returned to the area of Mullumbimby, and I was not informed of her school in WA for 3 months and could not see my daughter for weekend visits, which were then in place in the court orders. I had to make a decision about how to go forwards. Since the experience with Demack in court, I was traumatized and scared to actually go on living in Australia as I felt that I would not ever be given any time with my daughter, as the piece of paper I signed was basically a slow death of my relationship with my daughter. I had to return to the Lismore Federal Magistrate Court in March 2012 in Lismore, as I had commenced studies in Norway, and my ex-husband wanted to disturb my studies with calling me to court from Norway to Australia. I experienced such trauma and distress at the thought of returning to Australia and having to face Judge Demack again that I had to stop my studies. I was extremely traumatized to return to the court building in Lismore, and more so to face Demack. I got the support of my ex-husband's stepmother from South Africa, whom came all the way from South Africa to support me to face up to Demack again. The father did not appear, and he was excused to do so. To my utter relief, Demack was not there that day. I wanted make-up time with my daughter. For the weekends I was not granted due to him moving Hedda away from New South Wales and to Perth. I was granted no make-up time. I was told by Judge Jared to get a lawyer. I flew from New South Wales and all the way to Perth and was not going to be granted any time with my daughter at all until many people called the father to beg him to let him see my daughter. I got 4 hours with my daughter, with the father supervising the visit. I organized witnesses to be present without his knowledge for my own protection and safety. I was then called back to the court in August 2012 in Australia. I had managed to get a barrister in Sydney, and he needed more time to prepare my case. But Demack refused to defer the case and threw out my affidavits and made final orders without anyone representing me or including me with any true regard as Hedda's mother. This caused me another trauma and deep depression. I am of the opinion, when Demack is acting in the way that she has done during my matter in a chronic behavior, that the lawyers are afraid of Demack and will protect their own interests when it is known by the legal fraternity that Anne Demack kicks out barristers without charging them and issuing them significant fees. The orders were done, and then a week or so later a new version was done to state that the father could remove my daughter to the UK for 6 months or more without the prior consent of the mother. I tried to stop an Australian passport being issued to my daughter, as my daughter had a Norwegian one and I wanted her to have it renewed. Demack allowed the Australian passport to be granted and removed the PACE alert so the father could abscond with our daughter with no return ticket to Australia. He has remained a resident in the UK for 9 months now. I am placing a copy of this letter on video for public record. I am also doing it to protect any person who is feeling threatened by Anne Demack, and I have notified my government that if any Australian needs refugee status, that they may reside at my house free of charge. My daughter has been moved around from home to home, from school to school, and had many different women look after her. I was blamed for not having stability in my daughter's life, for moving her in the same area and from one school to another. Yet Hedda's father, my daughter's father, had been allowed to break orders by removing our child interstate in Australia. The father absconded to the UK with the permission of Demack and without having to give myself a return date, and the father is now residing permanently in the UK. The father did not have more economic stability than myself, but was deemed to seem so under Demack. I had no whereabout of my daughter in the UK for 4 months, even though in Demack's ruling it states that the father must inform me of the school my daughter is attending. I have suffered enormous post-traumatic stress from what Demack has put me through, and how this conduct of a judge can be legal is a crime. I know that if I had gotten my transcripts, which at one point I was going to get, they would most certainly have been altered, just as John Astor's were altered. This Judge Demack must have a royal commission to look into the criminal handlings of her family cases and how she changes transcripts so she can treat people however she sees fit with her biased attitude and her uncouth manner towards the party she decides shall lose everything, including their child or children. I ask that a family law case be filmed with voice uptakes so judges as Demack cannot play their sadistic games in the Federal Magistrate Court of Australia. Judge Demack is a danger to parents and children and should not be permitted to practice in the Federal Magistrate Court in Brisbane or Lismore or any other court in Australia or in the world. I have no doubt that some people are not as strong as myself and would take their own lives than appear in front of Anne Demack. I cannot express this any milder. There needs to be a completion of a royal commission. I will issue copies of medical reports and will travel to Australia to any court hearing by the Regina against Anne Demack. If I have not had word from the Attorney General within 30 days, I will be making application to the Queen and my government to endeavour to protect the parents and children from Anne Demack. We would expect live film footage to protect the victims of such a crime ever reoccur again. I believe this is serious enough that you would be complicit in a crime if you fail to your duties to investigate this. You now have two persons in two nations and two separate court cases confirming to you the unlawful behaviours of a judge. A copy of this letter will be provided to the Regina in 30 days, in the hope and faith that this will be taken seriously and dealt with before more families are destroyed and killed. Yours sincerely, Scotta.
That's pretty shocking. Can you send me a copy of that so I can actually put it on the screen?